We walked around and we would take pictures. Of course, inevitably, someone comes out and say, "Why are you taking a picture of my house?"
That's Cevan LeSieur.
Most of the time, I gave them a reason, and they were like, "Okay, that's fine."
So why was Cevan taking pictures of strangers' houses?
My father, he was a businessman in Salt Lake City, and he was always into the history of the city. And I just, as a kid, I just got sucked right into it with him. And his favorite neighborhood was always the Avenues.
The Avenues is the oldest residential district in a city that is one of the oldest ones in the Mountain West.
There's a lot of architectural diversity. You have homes that constructed as early as the 1860s, not many, but a few. And there's always something to look at on every block in the Avenues.
On their adventures through the Avenues, Cevan and his dad would bring a book written by Utah's Historic Society that would give insights into the history and architecture of one of Utah's most unique neighborhoods.
That book was very outdated. It was falling apart. I tried to get a new copy. It wasn't available. And it was at that time that I decided to see if I could write a new book about the Avenues.
And that, dear listeners, is why Cevan was going around Salt Lake City taking pictures of his neighbors' houses and houses of complete strangers.
And I really can't remember a time anybody said, "Don't take a picture of my house."
Cevan's legwork resulted in a beautiful coffee table style book that features a photo and architectural description of over 697 houses and businesses in Salt Lake's Avenues.
When you combine the unique architecture with the unique stories of the homeowners, it really builds the character and history of the neighborhood.
From polygamists to golf promoters, pioneers to murderers, a house used as the set of a horror movie, and another that became a candy factory. Some of Utah's funniest and freakiest stories have connections to this less than 2 square mile historic district between Temple Square and the University of Utah.
And I'd say 20% of it is from speaking to people that lived in the neighborhood that I knew.
On this episode of That Doesn't Happen Every Day, the podcast in which we interview everyday people about things that don't normally happen every day, I asked Cevan to tell me the quirky, fun, and even frightening stories he uncovered during his quest to learn everything he could about this little neighborhood he lived in on a mountainside east of the Great Salt Lake.
The earliest homes were your most basic, Adobe styles, structures, the true pioneer homes of the era.
The oldest surviving house in Cevan's book is on B Street in the western part of the Avenues, not far from Temple Square. Despite being believed to have been built around the time that America's Civil War ended in 1865, it looks really good. Other than having a really steep roof and 2 chimneys, it probably wouldn't stick out to you too much if you drove by it. What actually does stick out, and is probably a good place to start this story, is Cevan's description. Its foundation was made of granite left over from the construction of the Salt Lake LDS Temple, and was built by William Bell Barton, an immigrant from England who lived in the home with his 2 wives and was a clerk for the presiding bishop's office of the LDS Church. That's a lot to unpack, and given that you can't really talk about something historical from Utah without talking a lot about the LDS Church, here's a bit of background. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aka the LDS Church, or sometimes still just called the Mormon Church because of its use of the Book of Mormon, got its start in New York State in the early 1800s. After its prophet, Joseph Smith, was murdered by an anti-Mormon mob in 1844 in Illinois, Brigham Young became its new prophet and led those early members of the church away from the violence they were experiencing to the Great Salt Lake Valley. Mr. Bell, the Englishman who built that house, was one of thousands of people, many from the UK and Scandinavia, who joined the LDS Church and moved to the growing LDS settlement and crossroads of the West, known as Salt Lake City. The Salt Lake City Temple was one of many religious structures built in the New Zion by the LDS Church, and apparently Mr. Bell got some of its surplus stone to build his house. The Salt Lake City Temple still stands, and it's across the street from where the avenues start, at the corner of North State Street and South Temple. And as far as the 2 wives go, it is a fact that until 1890, the LDS Church did allow its members to practice polygamy like Mr. Bell. However, not all members of the early church were polygamists.
People often ask about polygamist homes in the avenues, and there definitely were some, but those types of homes are all found in the southwestern portion of the avenues.
The majority of work done in the LDS church is actually done on a volunteer basis, but even today there are people like Mr. Bell who do have full-time paid jobs with the church, like accountants and now IT people. My favorite story Cevan shared about someone who worked for the church living in the avenues was that of Mr. David Watts. In LDS belief, the president of the LDS church is esteemed as a prophet, able to receive revelation from God to direct the church. Mr. Watts, this other resident of the avenues, was close with David O. McKay, who served as the president and prophet of the LDS church from 1951 to 1970. In reading Cevan's book, I was curious what the connection was between this man living in a small Victorian eclectic home on 6th Avenue and this latter-day prophet, seer, and revelator. It turns out Mr. Watts worked as a barber in the LDS office building downtown and was known for being David O. McKay's personal barber for many, many years. I just wonder, when you're cutting a prophet's hair, what do you talk about? The history of Salt Lake and the avenues hasn't always been about LDS people, though. In fact,
by 1910, the incorporated Salt Lake City was less than 50% Mormon because of the influx of miners and businessmen that came with the Transcontinental Railroad and the boom of mining in the state of Utah and such. Non-LDS business leaders tended to actually populate the avenues in large numbers. So outside of the southwest corners, for a time period, the avenues became very non-Mormon.
Sure enough, eastward in the avenues on 3rd Avenue, in a beautiful red brick Victorian eclectic with bay windows built in 1896, lived the chairman of the innocuously named American Party. One of his fellow office holders lived over in a beautiful Victorian eclectic over on R Street, also in the eastern avenues. This Utah-based party was often referred to in news articles of the time as an anti-Mormon party, because of their stances and politics, though I couldn't find them referring to themselves that way specifically. Apparently, this party sort of fizzled out by 1911, but even then, odd things continued to occur between LDS folks and people not of that faith. We go over to 1st Avenue to a beautiful red brick church built in the early 1900s. While churches aren't unusual in Utah, this isn't an LDS one.
We're talking about the Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church. Fantastic building. Preserved church. It was built because the Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church sent a mission to Salt Lake City, basically thinking that by establishing a church here, they could convert the Danish converts back to their original religion.
This whole thing may sound strange or maybe like oddly specific for people 5,000 miles from Utah to go and try to reclaim some former Lutherans, but again, there's some history to this. After the LDS Church was formed, it started extensive missionary efforts within the U.S., and by the mid-1800s sent missionaries to places like Hawaii and, as mentioned, England and Scandinavia. Denmark, which is and was mostly Lutheran, was one of the countries where LDS missionaries saw a lot of conversions. For the next 20 years or so, almost half the immigrants leaving Denmark for the U.S. were LDS converts.
The congregation still exists after all these years, so whether they were successful in reconverting Mormons or not, they were successful in establishing a Lutheran church in Salt Lake City, and I believe it's either the oldest or second oldest Lutheran congregation in the state of Utah, which also then makes it one of the oldest Lutheran congregations west of the Mississippi.
Cevan said that the actual congregation has moved to a different church in Salt Lake City, and that the old church is now a residence and a business. I promised that was the last discussion of politics or religion on this episode, and now we'll turn to the subjects that unite us all: food and murder. Well, the murder will come in a minute. Just wait. To start the segment, we go to a cute little Queen Anne house on C Street. It appears to be just one story, but boasts a turret where its front corner would be, and a half-dome roof, like on an observatory. It was the home of a king. Not like King Ludwig or King James, but my favorite kind of king. A chili king. In 1908, Otto Branning, a.k.a. King Otto Branning, moved into this house.
The Chili Parlor restaurant was a popular restaurant in Salt Lake in the 20s, and he was the owner, known as the Chili King of Salt Lake.
If I was a chili king, believe me, I would have a crown and make sure everyone showed me deference wherever I went.
I want to, show that these homes were owned by, business owners and middle class and upper middle class people. And that's what makes the avenues unique. It was always more of a middle class area for people.
All kidding aside, I was able to find a picture of King Branning. He's wearing not a crown, but a sombrero for some reason, and has a mustache that curls up at the corners. So I figured if not a good king, he was probably an eccentric one. I wonder if the sombrero was part of a branding thing, as I guess chili hadn't been introduced officially to the U.S. until fairly recently. Still thinking about food, we now go to a small Greek revival house on First Avenue, where Mr. Art Davis lived and would one day start the Grabbateria.
The Grabbateria was a business. My father used to talk about this business in downtown Salt Lake. They would have sandwiches or meals, and like you would walk through, you would open the door and take what you want and then go check out. So very modern thing for the time period.
A 2015 article from the Salt Lake Tribune shares this. There was enough room for about 50 people inside of the Grabbateria as long as they were standing up, and even mentions that it was sort of like a bar, but, for sandwiches. The actual Grabbateria was downtown, but the owner did live in that house on First Avenue. I was excited to read that over in an unassuming house on 6th Avenue, George Strictly started the Strictly Candy Company, and while most other business owners in the avenues had to go downtown to go to work, his operations were right in the residential area of the avenues.
I always think that's an interesting example of a commercial operation that size in the middle of a residential neighborhood. You can imagine like trucks and stuff going up and down getting candy. It always seemed very unique to me that would have been established in the center of a block.
Maybe they paid off the neighbors with candy.
Maybe.
In keeping with the subject of food, sort of, we go from Victorian eclectics and Greek revival houses to gingerbread houses.
The developer, Elmer Darling, was trying to build a number of homes, and at least 6 to 8 large Victorians were built in that little section of the avenues, and they're quite extravagant for the neighborhood.
There are different kinds of Victorian houses, but in a very brief summary, they're tall and have lots of ornate details that make the homes look like big doll houses or gingerbread houses, or
they kind of look like haunted houses, a lot of them.
This brings us to my favorite house in all of the avenues on First Avenue. When I was in my early 20s finishing college in Salt Lake, I'd go running at night through the avenues and find myself face to face with Utah's best attempt at being the set of a horror movie. In fact, in 1989, it was used in part for the filming of Halloween 5, The Revenge of Michael Myers. At the time, I didn't know anything about that. It was just, the curb appeal, or whatever you call it. Basically, it has 3 big stories on top of a thick stone foundation that whispers of a deep cellar or basement. It has ornate windows, 2 chimneys, and a big fat turret jutting out towards the street, capped off by a conical roof like a witch's hat. And just under the witch's hat was a big open space. There wasn't any glass or anything. It was like an observation deck. But from my angle, it was kind of hard to see who might be up there, but they could definitely be watching you down on the street from the shadows. Cevan's book said this: the house was built in 1893, and there was nothing especially scary about its history from there. In 1902, Hoyt Sherman purchased it, and he served on the Utah Commission, which was established by the federal government to suppress the practice of polygamy. In 1916, the home was sold to Claude W. Freed, known as the father of golf in Utah and a founding member of the Salt Lake Country Club. And that's it. The home was then converted into apartments in 1938, and now it's being restored to a single-family home by a couple. I suppose I should be relieved, but I think I'm disappointed that this house I was so scared of was occupied by people no more strange than someone who hated polygamy and someone else who loved golf and country clubs. I think Cevan is just trying to pick up my spirits a little bit. He said that that house I was afraid of is not far from another house in the Darlington edition that also everyone had some fears about.
And I don't know if the people that live there just like played into it, but it really looks like a Disney version of a haunted house too. And my kids would would basically always be looking for, we'd walk by at night and they're looking for the ghost in the window and stuff. And it really became a thing in the neighborhood. But I almost felt like the people that lived there, or the woman that lived there, just kind of like played into the theme a little bit. Just leave out an empty baby carriage sitting on the front stoop, little things like that.
I want her on the podcast now.
Not all of the scary things about the avenues fall under the fun Hollywood Disney haunted house kind of scary.
Oh, the Ted Bundy house situation. I don't know if we want to go into the history of who Ted Bundy was, but
I think popular culture and true crime have said enough about Ted Bundy, but in a nutshell, he murdered and committed other horrible crimes across many states. But in 1974, he hadn't been caught for anything yet, and he enrolled at the University of Utah.
He did live in the avenues in at least 2 properties that I know of. So, and I'm pretty sure, not knowing the exact history, that at least one of his victims was from the avenues at that time.
Cevan's publisher didn't want him to mention any of Bundy's residences, but they are online if you want to look them up. Cevan's book does mention at least one house loosely connected with the murder, though. Near that house I was afraid of on First Avenue was the prairie-style bungalow of Dr. Frank Moormeister and his wife, Grace Dexter Moormeister. Mrs. Moormeister was found on the west edge of Salt Lake City, dead after having been ran over by her own car, some say several times. The year was 1930, and the apparent murder weapon was a 1929 Cadillac. No one has ever been convicted of this crime, and some people even refer to it as Utah's Black Dahlia. The house listed as the home of the Moormeisters is completely unassuming and not one you'd really pick out from the street if you were passing by. Quick note, some sources say that the doctor and his wife actually lived on South Temple, but if they did, it looks like that house has been torn down. We go from that murder outside of SLC to an actual attempted murder within the avenues. A big brick American four-square home now is on I Street in the avenues, but it was originally on First Avenue and occupied by Utah's Governor William Spry, who served from 1911 to 1917. While Governor Spry was in office, the murder conviction of a Swedish immigrant captured international attention.
Do you know the story about Joe Hill? So Joe Hill was a early labor leader.
I've linked an article about Joe Hill. Apparently he was a big deal in the Workers of the World movement, which, while crusading for workers' rights, also really upset a lot of people. In 1914, Hill appeared at the home of a doctor in Salt Lake City with a gunshot wound he said he'd gotten after a fight over a woman that he refused to name. The problem was that same night in Salt Lake, 2 men were shot to death in a grocery store robbery. Although one of the grocers was a former policeman who could have easily been killed by enemies he'd made while in law enforcement, and although 4 other people also reported to doctors that night with gunshot wounds, I didn't know Salt Lake was that, shooty of a place, Hill was tried and convicted of the murders. As Joe Hill's execution loomed, pleas for clemency came from President Woodrow Wilson, Helen Keller, and a Swedish ambassador. Governor William Spry, living in that house then on First Avenue, was unmoved, and in 1915, as the leader of Hill's firing squad in Utah's Sugar House prison called Ready, Aim, Hill is said to have interrupted and said, "Fire, go ahead and fire." And they did. Either the December after or the December after that December, a bomb was discovered in the front yard of the governor's house on First Avenue. Apparently someone was sweeping the snow and found it. I will never, ever sweep snow, shovel snow, or do anything in a famous person's yard who's upset everyone. In fact, later that year, a rail car exploded carrying a mail bomb addressed to Governor Spry. Despite the attempts to kill William Spry, he didn't die until 1929 of natural causes. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Avenues was experiencing something of a change.
And the avenues had been the center of the 1960s countercultural movement into the 70s.
In fact, in the 1970s, a craftsman-style home on Fifth Avenue was called a cooperative residence. I couldn't find any news articles exactly about that, but repeated ads to rent the place referred to it as Blithering Heights.
It's a beautiful home.
I wanted to share just a few more notable residents of the Avenues that Cevan's book pointed out. Attorney Enos Hodge, who was one of the men who unsuccessfully defended John D. Lee for his part in the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and Dr. William Beer, who was put in charge of German POWs at nearby Fort Douglas during World War I, both lived on B Street in 3-story Victorian eclectic homes. Mr. Henry Kasai lived in a house on D Street and sold insurance until he and his wife were forced to leave that house on D Street for a Japanese internment camp during the war. Fortunately, after the war, they were able to return and lived in the house until the 1970s. Back over on Fifth Avenue, in another unassuming house, Mrs. Amy Barnes lived until 1955. She had literally walked to Utah as part of one of the Mormon handcart companies. That house stayed in her family until the 1980s. While the avenues appear to have a lot of protections against demolition and major changes, I asked Cevan what you would lose if you lost this old part of Salt Lake.
Community. You lose community. I mean, this is just a personal thing, and everyone's different, but, I would much rather live in an old home with all the troubles that can occur because of it versus living in a new construction any day, because you do feel the vibes, and the longer you live there, you see the evidence of previous owners and their lives and what they put into the house and the experiences they had. And you kind of start to feel like you carry on a legacy.
Just about every structure we talked about in this story is a private residence. If you want to see them, I just ask that you stay on the sidewalk and please be respectful to the homes and the people that live in them. Big shout out to Cevan LeSieur. I just cold emailed this guy and asked if he would be on my podcast, and he got back to me very quickly and was great, so thank you so much. If you would like to buy either of Cevan's books about the Avenues, I've put the links in the description. One is just called The Avenues, Salt Lake City, 2nd edition. The other is called Images of America, Utah, The Avenues. Again, please go to the link in the description and get both of his books. I want to give a shout out to KHOL in Jackson for playing the show. If you would like to support the show, please go to That Doesn't Happen Every Day podcast. If you go to the webpage and scroll down, there's a place where you can send me money. However, I just hope you enjoy the show and that you share it with someone who you think might also like it. You can also listen to every past episode I've ever done at that same website. Thank you again so much for listening. I hope to have a new episode to you in about 2 weeks.